Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In this video, we'll look at the form of economic system before capitalism, and this is the transitionary period between feudalism and capitalism in Europe. And mercantile capitalism existed in Europe between the 15th and the 18th centuries. So mercantilism was the first phase of capitalism, and this was dominant between 15th and 18th centuries in Europe. The main players were England, Spain, Netherlands, France, and Portugal. So these were the five key players who were involved in mercantile capitalism during this time. And this was a state-guided economic system, and it had some features. The first feature was it was trade-driven. So the economic system revolved around trade. So the countries were trying to become strong by promoting trade. And the way they promoted trade is by exporting as much as possible. So the idea was you need a lot of gold, bullion to empower yourself and to become strong nationally. So to do that, you need gold. And the way to acquire gold is through trade and colonialism. The second feature of mercantile capitalism is colony based. So it relied on the colonies to to export and to loot and plunder and to become strong nationally. It was strongly state controlled. That's the third feature. So the state was behind this. So it was not like the free market laissez-faire capitalism that we'll see later after the 18th century, but rather this was very much a state-controlled economic system where the state was standing behind this trade and trying to gather as much gold as possible from around the globe. So governments were an active player in the economy and they were trying to increase their national power. So the idea was, as I mentioned, the goal was to accumulate gold, and gold was seen as the tool to increase the national power. So it was all about power, and gold and trade helped in maximizing that power. So trade and colonies were used, and this is the main focus of the mercantile capitalism. So how did they do that? We said the state was standing behind to promote trade and accumulate gold and silver. The idea was that the exports must be greater than imports. You need to have as much gold as possible. So these are the key policies and the tools which these mercantile powers try to adopt. The first is tariffs on imports. This means that you you discourage imports, so you put a lot of tax on imports so that people are encouraged to produce domestically and encouraged to export but not import. So you put tariffs to make the foreign goods more expensive. Now they also granted monopoly charters to companies like the East India Company. Similarly, you had similar countries, uh, all of them establishing companies, like the Dutch also. They had their own company. So East India Company was established in India. So now these companies were monopolies. So the government had given them monopoly status. So only they were allowed to trade in certain goods and certain spices with certain countries. So they had monopoly powers and the state was behind them. And they also passed laws such as the Navigation Acts to control shipping and trade. So the entire ecosystem was supportive of this trade and these companies. Similarly, government controls trade to keep a favorable balance. So you see, when exports are greater than imports, then you have a trade surplus. However, when exports are less than imports, then you have a trade deficit, which means that the gold reserves reduce. So you reduce your national power. So in their mind, gold was equal to power. So if the gold is reducing, you're losing your power. So they want the exports to be higher than the imports. So they don't want a trade deficit. So they always try to have a surplus to ensure that the coal keeps coming in. Another policy they used was the protection of the domestic producers. So there is the infantile industry argument that they wanted to develop their domestic industries. So they put tariffs on imports. So the people cannot import, or the imports are very expensive. So the local producers are incentivized to produce domestically. So on the one hand, you have high exports, you have low imports, and also you have a lot of focus on domestic production. So that really helps to grow your economy. Also, there was a control of key trade routes and markets. Uh, the colonies were being used to sell the finished products. So the colonies actually were being used in two ways. So first of all, these colonial powers were buying cheap raw materials from these colonies, and then also they were using these colonies as the markets for the finished products. So they used to take the raw materials, bring them back to England, process them, and then once the processed final product is ready, they used to sell it back in India at a high cost. So that's how they were doing the arbitrage: buy low and sell high. So these were all the policies and tools which these mercantile economic players were adopting between the 15th and the 18th centuries. So mercantilism was closely related to colonialism, and the colonial powers, these mercantile powers, established colonies in Americas, in Asia and Africa, and they used these colonies for their raw materials, and they also used them for selling the finished goods as markets. So they had a two-pronged strategy. One is to buy or loot raw materials and then sell the finished goods. And trade was often restricted so that the colonies could only trade with the colonizer. So for example, if England is the colonizer and the colony is India, then India would be prohibited to trade with any other country. So they would have an exclusive contract with England. So whatever the raw materials India produces could only be exported to England. So England would take all the produce of India and then process it using their industries, and then again sell it back to India. And these Indian producers were not allowed to trade with the outside world. So this was also another form of exploitation. And the system was brutal. It involved the exploitation of resources, it involved slavery, exploitation of labor, and violent conquests, and a lot of killings, loot and plunder. So this system was actually this mercantilist system was intertwined with colonialism, and that's really what gave these European countries the initial boost, the capital to grow and develop rapidly. So one issue in this period was the issue of wealth, how wealth was defined. So in the mercantile period between the 15th and the 18th centuries, wealth was defined as gold and silver, and these European powers were competing with each other to accumulate as much gold and silver through trade policies, through exports, and so on. This idea, of course, was challenged later on famously by Adam Smith, who defined wealth in a different way as the production of goods and services in an economy rather than the accumulation of gold. But this was actually a central point of contention between mercantilist thought and the later capitalist thought, starting with Adam Smith. Uh, Governments aimed to ensure that the exports were greater than imports and that the bullion would keep flowing into the country. And as I mentioned, this idea of bullion was strongly connected to national power. The logic was that the more bullion a nation had, it would be stronger militarily and politically. So they have more gold, they could finance wars, they could uh, finance their armies, and so the fiscal policy was the accumulation of gold because gold helped to mobilize the armies and increase the ability to fight. And the states were intervening heavily because of geopolitics. The monarchies needed money to finance wars, to build navies, and to compete with rival powers in Europe. So England and Portugal and Spain and Netherlands, these were all competing powers. So the way they had to fight with each other is through increasing the gold reserves, through colonizing and increasing the exports. So it was really uh, a geopolitical kind of economic system, not just purely economic. It had a lot to do with the politics of the time, and then protecting the producers domestically, controlling the trade routes were considered as essential for survival and for maintaining the power. So markets were not just about profit, they were intertwined with state power. So, so starting from the 18th century, we see that Adam Smith and these are the classical economists, famously Adam Smith and Ricardo, they were not happy with the mercantilist policies, so they wrote some books and they argued that the monopolies and protectionist policies actually distorted the markets and they held back growth. So Adam Smith famously he argued and supported the invisible hand concept that the markets should be left alone, and he defined wealth as the goods and services produced in a country or the productive capacity, not the gold bullions and gold and silver. So he says that the state needs to stay out of the market and let the market operate freely and based on the consumers and producers coming together in the market, they will have optimal outcomes. So Adam Smith laid out his arguments in his famous The Wealth of Nations. Similarly, David Ricardo also had um, issues with the mercantilist thought, and he introduced the idea of comparative advantage, showing that the free trade could benefit all nations. So earlier, trade was treated as a zero-sum game, i.e., if one party is exporting and the other is importing, then one of them is benefiting and the other is losing. And then he showed that actually trade is good for both countries. And if each country focused on what they're good at producing, then and they exported that, then it is a win-win for both the countries. So it's not a zero-sum game. Both countries will benefit if they trade with each other. So to sum up, mercantilism was the economic system in Europe, more specifically followed by countries like England, Netherlands, uh, Portugal, and Spain. And this system actually tied state power, trade, policy, and colonialism together. So they all went hand in hand. So trade, national power, and colonialism went hand in hand. And all the policies were intended to increase the gold and silver reserves and that was through various tools and policies that we discussed. And wealth was seen as finite bullion, not overall prosperity. So the focus was of increasing the wealth of the monarch, wealth of the country, of the nation. So these were nation states. The mercantile policies were trying to strengthen the nation state. So the prosperity of the people was not the focus. So Adam Smith later he says that the real prosperity is the prosperity of the people. So production of goods and services within the country will actually lead to prosperity and opulence of the masses of the people. So the shift from national power to prosperity of the people happens later. Although we see that capitalism had its own issues, but Adam Smith's original ideas was that if production is done, if there is a focus on production, the people will benefit from that, and then that would lead to the invisible hand will bring about prosperity and welfare of all the people. So the focus should not be on accumulating gold, rather the focus should be on production. But that didn't happen, and Karl Marx laid a smackdown on capitalism a century later. So, and finally, classical economists also pushed for ideas of free trade, and they said that trade is not a zero-sum game. Both countries will benefit if they focus on exporting what they are good at. So these are the key takeaways of the mercantile capitalism, which was the economic system of Europe between the 15th and the 18th centuries.